Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Black Pine Archives. Tonight, we are bringing you 9 documented middle-of-nowhere horror stories that begin like ordinary travel problems and end like the road itself learned your habits. These are not ghost tales written for entertainment, but compiled accounts drawn from emergency logs, field reports, carrier records, and the kind of personal artifacts people keep when no one believes them. If you appreciate grounded horror that feels like it could happen 1 mile past the last streetlight, subscribe to Black Pine Archives and turn on notifications. After these 9 cases, leave a comment with the one detail that stuck with you, because the smallest details are usually the ones that matter. The storm arrived early and fast, the kind of inland squall that turned daylight into a wet gray smear and made the highway feel narrower than it really was. 4 friends were driving back from a long weekend, the kind of tired where conversation came in short bursts and the rest of the time was filled with wiper noise and the low hum of the engine. Their navigation unit chimed, rerouted, and quietly suggested an alternate path to avoid a reported closure up ahead. On the screen, the new route bent off the main highway, cut across a cluster of surface roads, and rejoined the interstate miles later. A town name appeared for a moment above the cluster. Then the map refreshed. The label flickered once and returned as a blank strip of gray where the name had been, like someone had selected it and pressed delete. They took the exit anyway. The weather behind them had thickened into a wall of rain, and their fuel gauge had sagged below the point where pride was practical. The off-ramp curved down through a stand of wet pines, the guardrails shining in their headlights like damp bones. There were no welcome signs, no population counts, no speed limit reductions. The navigation's voice went silent, replaced by a thin, patient arrow drifting over unlabeled lines. The road opened into a compact grid of streets with no visible names. No street signs at the corners, no business logos on the low buildings. A diner glowed with a faded neon coffee cup in the window. A small cafe sat on the corner with fogged glass, and a closed sign flipped to open without any hours printed on it. A row of streetlights stood at even intervals, their bulbs glowing a weak yellow-white that seemed to light only the air immediately around them and not the pavement beneath. The town did not look abandoned. The sidewalks were clear of debris. The windows were intact. There were curtains, potted plants, a bicycle leaning against a railing. It looked maintained and recently used, but it also looked like it had been scrubbed of identifiers, the way sensitive documents are redacted. Caller reports no town name on signs. GPS shows blank label. From the 911 log, they did what travelers always do in uncertain places. They tried to fix themselves to a map. One of them held up a phone and waited for bars that never appeared. Another checked the vehicle's onboard navigation, only to find the map tile under their position washed in featureless gray. The arrow representing their car floated over it without coordinates or labels. Then they noticed the times. The dashboard clock showed one time, slightly ahead of the last hour they remembered. A phone lock screen showed another, off by several minutes in the other direction. A smartwatch on one wrist lagged behind both. At first, they assumed someone had never corrected for daylight saving time, or that the car clock had drifted. Then they realized the difference between devices was not constant. The gaps widened and narrowed as if each object kept time according to a different rule. All devices show different time drift, plus or minus 20 minutes. From a vehicle inspection note, inside the cafe, the air was warm and smelled of fryer oil, old coffee, and wet jackets. A television mounted in a corner played a muted channel that cycled through news footage without a visible logo in the corner of the screen. The bottom ticker showed no dates, no specific locations, just generic headlines that could have belonged to almost any year. The staff moved with the smooth, repetitive motions of people who had done the same work for a long time, but they avoided anything that might fix them in context. No name tags, no small talk about the weather or where anyone was headed. When asked about the storm, they gave short, neutral answers, stripped of references to yesterday, tomorrow, or particular days of the week. The wall behind the counter had no health inspection certificate, no local sports posters, no community flyers. They ordered simple food and coffee. The prices were reasonable, written on a board with no currency symbol. When they handed over cash, the register beeped once and pushed out a thin strip of thermal paper. The cashier tore it off and passed it over without a word. The paper was already slightly damp from their fingers. That receipt became the close-up artifact that held the story together later. The header listed a cafe name that, when searched, matched nothing in any directory. The state abbreviation was wrong by one letter. There was no street address, no phone number, no website. The time field showed two separate minute values printed on the same line, overlapping slightly, as if the machine had been given two answers to the question now and printed both. They did not notice all of that immediately. One of them folded the receipt once, twice, then crumpled it and shoved it into a pocket, with the vague sense that throwing it away would be a mistake they did not know how to describe. Outside, the storm rolled over the roofs like a slow, heavy tide. The streetlights along the main road began to flicker, not randomly, not with the irregular sputter of a failing transformer, but in a pattern that settled quickly into a rhythm. 3 pulses, a pause, 3 pulses. The intervals between pulses were almost identical, tight enough that one of the group, who worked with industrial systems, felt the back of his neck prickle in the way it did when a machine was test cycling. The pattern continued even when no vehicles passed. 3 pulses. Pause. 3 pulses. It felt less like a malfunction and more like a signal, not aimed at the road, but at whoever was watching the road. They decided to leave, each for their own reasons that all came down to the same feeling. They were in a place that did not want to be looked up later. The navigation, when forced to recalculate, produced a looping route that guided them away from the cafe, around several corners, and then back past the same building from the opposite direction. The cafe's fogged windows looked different only in angle, not content. The same pickup truck sat in the same position. The same drip mark ran down from the gutter over the door. They turned manually, ignoring the device, and tried a different sequence of streets. The road surfaces repeated, the same cracked median, the same pothole filled to the brim with rainwater, reflecting the light in a flattened, trembling disc. The same crooked mailbox with its numbers painted over. They argued quietly about whether they had taken a wrong turn, whether they were panicking and misremembering. To test it, they drove over a shallow puddle close to the curb, sending a fan of water over the sidewalk. 5 minutes later, they passed the same storefront again. The puddle was undisturbed, no trace of their tires. They called for help because there was nothing else left to do that felt like action. The signal indicator on one phone showed a single bar that flickered like a candle. The call that went through sounded stretched and thinned, the dispatcher's voice arriving with a lag that made normal conversation difficult. They gave their description of the town, the absence of signs, the blank label on their navigation, the way their clocks refused to agree. Caller reports no town name on signs. GPS shows blank label. From the 911 log, the dispatcher repeated what they could hear of the coordinates and promised to check. There was a pause on the line then, longer than protocol, the sound of someone looking at a screen and not liking what they saw. When the dispatcher spoke again, the tone had changed in a way the group did not forget. No municipality record for coordinates provided. From the county office reply. Even in the official reply later, the wording was careful. The coordinates existed, the land existed, the municipal record did not. There was no town registered where the groups said they were, no road network mapped the way they described. The closest recognized road segments ended miles away. On digital maps used by emergency services, a patrol unit was dispatched anyway. Procedure required a physical check when people used words like lost, trapped, or wrong. The officer found the highway exit they had described in terms of distance from known markers, but the ramp led to a narrow service lane that dead-ended at a locked gate. Beyond the gate, a drainage cut and a stand of wet, dark timber. No diner, no cafe, no grid of streets. The officer followed a parallel road network and found nothing but farmland and a shuttered grain elevator. The report later used an unusual term for a map that simply refused to cooperate. It did not list the road as closed. It listed it as absent. The friends did not remember the exact moment they left. There was no clean jump in their memory, no tunnel or flash. The night simply thinned. The rain eased. The next time they truly paid attention to their surroundings, they were back on a known highway, the green mileage signs familiar, the shoulders wide, the hum of passing trucks a relief. Their fuel gauge had dropped farther than the number of miles they remembered should have allowed. Their bodies felt like they had been driving for longer than the time any of their devices admitted. One phone contained a short video clip taken inside the car, showing the dashboard clock and a passenger's watch in the same frame. Both in focus, both displaying different minutes at what should have been the same instant. The clip ended abruptly, cut off mid-breath, as if someone had removed a second of time from the file. At a kitchen table days later, they smoothed the cafe receipt out flat and scanned it under bright light. The two overlapping minute values in the time field were still visible, even as the rest of the ink began to fade. There was no town printed anywhere on the strip. No logo. No address. Only a name for a place that could not be found in any registry and a time that refused to settle into a single line. They compared stories and found their memories aligned on one point without needing to be coached. None of them remembered seeing a town name on any surface at any point. Not on a welcome sign, not on a mailbox, not painted on the diner window. Even the cafe's name, printed at the top of the receipt, felt less like a location and more like a placeholder. Over the following weeks, two of them tried independently to recreate the route using saved coordinates and navigation history. Each time the app produced an error tile where the detour should have been, a square of neutral color with no data loaded. It was not marked as restricted or private, it was simply blank, as if the system had decided that whatever lay there did not need to be rendered again. They stopped trying after that. The receipt went into an envelope. The video was backed up and then not mentioned in casual conversation. The only thing any of them still did was glance at the clock on the dashboard whenever the navigation suggested a detour and make sure that all their devices agreed on what counted as now. Archival transition. The first case began with a simple reroute and left behind a piece of paper that refused to pick a single minute. It should have anchored the event to a map and a time, but both resisted. The next case would start the same way, with a receipt, but instead of losing its address, it reached forward by one day and printed tomorrow. The driver was used to empty miles. He ran overnight freight between distribution hubs, the kind of route where the world narrowed to lane markings, reflector posts, and the slow crawl of the fuel gauge. His company records later listed him only as subject, but in reports his last name appeared clearly enough times to become part of the story. He had driven that stretch of highway in 3 different seasons and knew where the usual 24-hour stations were, which exits were safe, and which ones felt wrong in a way that did not fit on a form. On a cold, overcast night in late autumn, fatigue and schedule pressure made the decision for him. The tank was lower than he liked. The last major exit had been passed with the thought that the next one would be better. It was not. The highway shoulders pinched in, the tree line crept closer, and the reflective mile markers felt farther apart. When he finally saw a low glow ahead on the right, a canopy light over fuel pumps, a small square building beyond, it felt less like discovery and more like a concession. He took the ramp and rolled onto a short, cracked access road that widened into a gravel apron. The gas station looked ordinary at a glance. 2 pumps under a white canopy, a small convenience store with a glass door and a flickering open sign. The windows were bright with coolers and hanging fluorescent tubes. There were no brand colors, no familiar fuel logo, just generic white rectangles where signage could have been. He pulled beside the nearest pump and waited for the usual beeps and prompts. The digital display lit up, but there was no logo, only plain text asking him to pay inside. When he looked toward the building, he registered the first wrong detail. There was no lit price sign visible from the road, no tall pole announcing fuel grades to passing traffic. The station seemed designed only for whoever had already decided to turn in. He went inside, more focused on getting fuel than on reading the room. The air smelled of old coffee, cleaner, and a faint hint of damp cardboard. The coolers hummed in a steady, even tone. The shelves held the expected rows of snacks and bottled drinks, but none of the packaging had loyalty stickers or local promo tags. There were no posters for regional teams, no photo wall, no lottery signs. Behind the counter, the wall where a business license and inspection certificates usually hung was completely bare. The person at the register processed his card without small talk. The terminal beeped, the pump clicked on outside, and a narrow strip of thermal paper emerged from the receipt printer with a clean mechanical sound. He watched it print because he was tired, and that small motion gave his eyes something to focus on. The receipt slid toward him. He glanced at it long enough to see his last name, correctly spelled on the line where it usually appeared, and a date that did not match the one on his phone. The receipt showed tomorrow. Receipt date, tomorrow. Ink fresh. Store ID not found. From the protocol, he blinked, assuming he had misread it, then checked the date again. It was not a single-digit mistake. The entire line had moved forward by 1 day. The timestamp sat comfortably in a late-night slot, but the day was wrong by exactly 1 calendar step. The state abbreviation printed under the store name was off by 1 letter, as if someone had nearly copied his home state and missed. He stepped back out to the pumps and forced himself to finish fueling. The numbers on the pump display incremented normally. The cold air cleared his head, just enough for irritation to set in where unease had been. A wrong date on a receipt could complicate reimbursement. A mismatch on the state code could flag his account. These were problems he understood. He folded the receipt and shoved it into his wallet with the intention of calling the card company in the morning. He pulled back onto the dark access road and merged into the slow river of highway traffic. The station's canopy lights receded in his side mirror until they were swallowed by the tree line. For 2 or 3 miles, he tried to convince himself it had been a simple register misconfiguration, the kind of mistake any understaffed rural station could make. The thought did not settle. The more he replayed the details, the more he realized how little of the place had attached itself to his memory. He could not recall the clerk's face. He could not picture a name tag. He could not remember a logo on the fuel cap or a brand sticker on the door. The building existed in his mind as a layout, not as a location. He made a decision quickly. He would turn around at the next safe median cut or exit, go back and document it. A photo of the storefront, a picture of the pumps, and a clear shot of the receipt would at least give him something solid if the charge was ever questioned. Within minutes, he found a crossover used by maintenance vehicles, waited for a break in the sparse traffic, and executed a careful turnaround. The highway looked the same in reverse. Same railing, same pressure of trees, same raspy sound from the worn surface. He watched the mile markers count down, calculating the distance back to the ramp he had taken. He reached the point where the access road should have been and saw only an opening in the guardrail that led onto an empty gravel pad. No canopy, no pumps, no building, no sign. He took the turn anyway because his body remembered the motion even if his eyes now saw something different. The tires crunched over gravel that was damp but not rutted. The area where the fuel island should have sat was a flat expanse of packed dirt and small stones, with no anchor bolts, no concrete islands, no shadow lines where structures had once stood. The night that had previously held artificial light now held only sky glow and the passing sweep of other vehicles' headlights far out on the main lanes. He walked the site with his flashlight, tracing slow arcs that picked out details the way a camera might. There were tire marks, his own coming in and turning, then leaving. There were no obvious older tracks from other vehicles turning to approach pumps, no oil spots, no discarded receipts or drink cups. The gravel closest to the highway was flattened in a way that suggested occasional parking, but not regular business. Ground shows fresh tire marks, no building foundations. From the patrol report, that absence pressed on him harder than the presence of any derelict structure would have. If the station had been pulled out, there should have been remnants, plumbing stubs, electrical conduits, a darker rectangle where the building had sat. Instead, there was simply ground, unmarked by construction scars. He called it in from the shoulder of the highway, choosing his words carefully to make it sound less like a ghost story and more like a potential fraud case. He described fueling at a gas station that was no longer there less than an hour later. He described the receipt date printing as tomorrow. The dispatcher took his information, asked the standard questions about intoxication, head injury, and possible medication, and then dispatched a patrol unit out of protocol, if not belief. While he waited for the unit, he sat in the cab with the dome light on and unfolded the receipt. The date was still wrong. The ink was still sharp, not yet dulled by friction or heat. His last name was printed neatly, pulled, he assumed, from the card data. The store identifier string under it matched nothing he recognized from previous fuel stops. The state code was still misspelled. He took a photo of the receipt with his phone, then another of the empty lot through the windshield, making sure the highway and mile marker were visible in the background. The digital timestamps on the photos used the correct date. Search, no business license under listed name. From the county database. The officer who arrived found exactly what the driver had described, an empty gravel area with fresh tire marks and no sign of demolition. The patrol car's spotlight washed over the surface, revealing no anchor points or broken slab edges. The officer took his own photos, bagged the physical receipt, and logged it as an unusual item pending verification. Back at the station, a routine query was run through the county's business license database. No active or recently expired license existed under the name printed on the receipt header. A search across neighboring counties returned the same negative results. The store identifier did not match any approved fuel retailer code. The state abbreviation did not correspond to any recognized issuing region. The internal summary sheet captured the official position in neutral language. There was no record of a gas station at those coordinates. No tax filings, no environmental permits, no utility accounts. The photographs showed an unremarkable gravel turnout beside a rural highway. The only evidence of a functioning business was the receipt itself, which said more about time than about place. The driver carried a copy of that receipt in his wallet long after the original was sealed in an evidence envelope. Over weeks, the thermal ink on his copy began to fade in the way such paper always does, the edges of letters softening, the lighter strokes disappearing first. The date, however, remained legible longer than the rest, as if that line had been burned in deeper. The word for tomorrow's day and the numeral, when transcribed, matched precisely the date of a missed call notification on his phone that he did not remember hearing. The call log showed an incoming call from his own number, marked as missed, exactly 24 hours after he had fueled at the non-existent station. The timestamp aligned with the tomorrow printed on the receipt. His phone records showed no outgoing call at that time. The network provider's records did not show a completed connection. It was as if the call had tried to arrive from a place that knew his number but was not fully connected to the network that governed the rest of his life. He wrote one brief personal statement for the file. "I watched the pump run. I watched the receipt print. When I came back, there was nothing there. I know what it feels like to remember wrong, but this was not that." From the driver's written statement, after that, he stopped volunteering additional details. When co-workers asked informally why he refused to fuel anywhere but major chain stations, he shrugged it off as company policy and personal preference. He avoided exits with unbranded signs. He did not pull into wide gravel pullouts unless there were other vehicles already there. He began keeping just enough extra fuel in reserve to bypass stretches of highway that felt too empty, even if dispatch scolded him for the lost efficiency. He told one friend off the record that he had learned a distinction he had never needed to make before. Being lost, he said, was when you did not know where you were. Being processed was when something else did. Archival transition. The second case left behind a station that vanished cleanly, as if it had only borrowed a spot beside the highway long enough to write one day ahead on a strip of paper. It used a receipt to reach forward in time, printing tomorrow as casually as a total. The next case would not erase the building at all. The motel at the heart of it stayed where it was, waiting with a guest book already bearing the visitors' names. They were not looking for a story. They were looking for sleep. The travelers were a couple in their late 20s who had spent the day driving through a long rural corridor where the highway thinned into a two-lane road and the towns became fewer, farther apart, and harder to distinguish from the surrounding darkness. Their original plan had been simple: reach a larger city before midnight, check into a chain hotel, and be back on the road at first light. The plan collapsed the way plans often did out there, not with drama, but with small attritions, rain that slowed them, construction that forced them into detours, a missed turn that cost more time than it should have. By the time the navigation app suggested lodging, they were running on the kind of fatigue that makes a glowing sign feel like rescue. The screen showed a motel icon ahead, labeled as the nearest available option. The name looked generic, almost placeholder, and the address line flickered once before stabilizing. Neither traveler noticed the flicker until later, when they replayed the moment and realized the phone had behaved like it was loading a location from an unstable source. The motel appeared at the edge of the road, as if it had been built to be seen only at night. It sat low and wide, a single-story line of doors facing a shallow parking lot. A vacancy sign glowed in a washed-out red that made the wet asphalt shine like spilled oil. The windows of the office were lit from within, fogged by condensation, and the blinds were half open in a way that suggested someone had been watching the lot and then stepped away. The air smelled of rain, pine, and the faint sweetness of standing water. The parking lot held no other cars, no tire heat, no exhaust haze, no sound of doors closing elsewhere. The only noise was the soft ticking of their engine cooling and the steady hiss of rain sliding off the roof. They walked to the office door and found it locked, but not in a way that felt final. The knob turned a fraction and stopped, as if the lock had been engaged recently rather than left that way for weeks. A bell sat on the counter inside, visible through the glass, and above it a security camera faced the entrance. The camera's indicator light was on, but the lens did not sweep or adjust. It stared forward like an eye that did not need to blink. They circled the building and found a side door near a vending machine alcove. That door opened with a soft resistance, the kind that suggested swollen wood rather than a security measure. The inside air was warmer than expected, carrying a stale mixture of old carpet cleaner and something metallic, like damp coins. The office was lit, not brightly but steadily. The front desk looked prepared for guests. A pen sat uncapped beside an open guest book. A small plastic tray held key tags arranged in neat rows. A telephone sat on the corner of the counter, handset resting perfectly in place. Behind the desk there were no personal items, no jacket on a chair, no coffee cup, no calendar, no family photo. The space had the layout of a working office, but none of the human residue that usually made such places feel occupied. They called out once, more out of habit than expectation, and received nothing in return. No footsteps from a back room, no muted television, no toilet flush, no cough. The silence had a polished quality, as if the building was maintaining it. They looked at each other and the decision formed without being spoken. If the office was open and the guest book was laid out, they would sign in and take a room. It was late, the rain was steady, and the road behind them felt longer than it had any right to. The guest book was a thick binder with lined pages. The handwriting on the visible page was tight, consistent, and strangely uniform, as if one person had filled multiple entries with the same pen. Dates ran down one column. Room numbers were assigned with an efficiency that made the book feel more like a log than a courtesy. They flipped back a few pages, scanning for gaps or indications of recent arrivals. The entries continued without interruption. Names, dates, room numbers, occasional vehicle descriptions. All of it looked normal until they reached a page near the middle and saw something that made both of them stop moving at the same time. Their names were already written there. Both last names were spelled correctly. Both first names were correct, including the uncommon spelling of one of them that frequently got miswritten on reservations. The signatures matched not in a vague way, but in the way that a signature matched a person's hand. The same slant, the same pressure, the same habit of looping one letter too tightly. The room number assigned to them was the room the navigation app had suggested as available. The date beside the entry was the next day. Guestbook entry matches subject's signature style. From a handwriting note. They stared long enough for their minds to begin searching for explanations that would make it safe. Someone had copied their names from a credit card. Someone had pulled their details from a hacked device. Someone had played a prank. Someone had mistaken them for someone else. Each explanation failed on contact with the signatures. Those signatures were not typed. They were not printed. They were written in a way that imitated their specific hand. They checked the pen on the counter. It was damp at the tip, as if it had been used moments earlier. They touched the page gently and felt the slightest raised texture where the ink sat, too fresh to have fully settled. They backed away from the book and looked at the key tray behind the desk. The tags were old-style motel keychains, plastic rectangles with the room number printed large. Most of the hooks were empty. Several keys hung in place, arranged as if for incoming guests. One tag, the one with their assigned room number, held a key already clipped and waiting. When one of them reached for it, the tag was wet, not slick from condensation, wet like it had been held in a damp hand and then returned to the hook. A small drop slid down the plastic edge and fell to the counter with a sound that felt too loud in the empty office. They searched again for staff, moving through the office area and into a narrow hallway that led toward what looked like a storage room. The door to that back room was closed. The doorknob was warm, not hot, but warm enough to be noticed. They did not open it. They returned to the counter and tried the telephone, hoping for a landline that could reach local law enforcement even without cell service. The handset felt warm against the skin in a way that made the body react before the mind could interpret it. The line was dead. No dial tone, no click. Just emptiness, as if the phone was connected to nothing at all. Later, when the incident was reported, an inquiry to the carrier confirmed that the motel's registered line had been disconnected years earlier. Motel phone line disconnected since 2019. From the carrier statement, they did not stay long enough to test the key. They placed it back on its hook, and the wetness left a faint smear on the plastic tray. They stepped outside into the rain and walked quickly to their car, scanning the line of room doors as if they expected one of them to open. The curtains in the rooms were drawn uniformly, without gaps. No televisions glowed through fabric, no shadows moved. As they reached the car, the parking lot lights changed. Not a flicker, not a power fluctuation, a synchronized surge, all lights brightening together, then dimming together. 3 pulses, a pause, 3 pulses, the same pattern documented in other cases, the same steady rhythm that suggested imitation rather than malfunction. The couple stood under the rain and watched the lights repeat the pattern again and then again, as if the lot itself was practicing a signal. One of them pulled out a phone to record. The phone's camera struggled to focus the way cameras did in low light, hunting for edges. In the audio of that short clip, the rain sounded normal. The engine idled normal. The lights pulsed with mechanical steadiness. What did not sound normal was the faint undertone under the rain, a low electrical hum that rose slightly on each pulse, like a current being pushed through something that wanted to respond. They got in the car and drove out, wheels hissing over wet pavement. They did not stop until they reached an area with active service and visible commerce, a highway interchange, lit signs, other vehicles, the normal clutter of the human world. Only then did they call for help and report the motel, giving the road name they had seen on a marker and the mile reference they had passed. They provided the approximate coordinates from the navigation history. They sent the photo of the guestbook page and the short video of the pulsing lights. Patrol responded at dawn. The deputy's report documented a location that did not match the couple's description. The building on the roadside was real, but it presented as closed and decayed. The office windows were boarded. The vacancy sign was dark. The office door was swollen shut by rot and did not open when tested. No interior lights were visible. No guest book sat on a counter because there was no visible counter through the boarded glass. The deputy noted the structure, noted the lack of vehicles, and noted that the property appeared long abandoned. The report described the traveler's account with cautious neutrality, as if filing it was an obligation rather than an endorsement. Key tags present, no staff located. From the sheriff's report, the one element that could not be dismissed as easily was the photograph. The photo showed the guestbook open to the page with their names. It showed the date beside those names as the next day. It showed their signatures in ink. In the corner of the frame, visible only because the phone's angle had caught it, was part of the office wall where an inspection certificate would normally be displayed. That wall was blank. The image metadata introduced another complication. The timestamp on the photo disagreed with both of their phone's system clocks by nearly 20 minutes, mirroring the drift described in the earlier Nameless Town case. The two phones also disagreed with each other, as if they had each been pulled toward a different now while standing in the same room. In the weeks that followed, investigators attempted the rational routes first. They checked property records, they checked utility histories, they checked for any recent renovation permits that might explain an office being temporarily open. They found none. The property had been in tax delinquency for years. The phone line had been disconnected since 2019. No business license had been active under the motel name in the county database. The motel, on paper, was a dead place. But the couple's evidence suggested a living moment had existed inside it, briefly, with its own rules. The key tag became the close-up object the case returned to again and again. The couple described its wetness consistently, not rainwater, not condensation, but the distinct feel of something recently held. When asked why they did not take the key as evidence, one of them later wrote a sentence that appeared in the supplemental file. "It felt like it wanted my handprint. It felt like it was waiting for me to agree to the room." From a written statement. After the incident, both travelers changed their habits in small, practical ways. They stopped accepting nearest lodging prompts from navigation at late hours. They avoided motels that displayed a vacancy sign without any other cars in the lot. They began taking photos of posted addresses and business licenses as a form of grounding, as if a printed street number could anchor a building in reality. Neither of them could explain why their signatures had been there. Neither could explain the date. Neither could explain the warm phone handset, connected to a line that should have been dead for years. What they could explain was the feeling that the motel had not been empty. It had been prepared. Archival transition. The motel did not need staff because it did not require human permission. It offered a room by writing the guests into existence on paper before they arrived. The next case would strip away even the illusion of hospitality. There would be no desk, no keys, no shelter at all. Only a rest area that still appeared on maps, and cameras positioned not for security, but for observation. The family had been on the road long enough that their sense of normal had narrowed to simple needs: fuel, a bathroom, a place to stretch legs without stepping into traffic. Their route ran through a long rural corridor where the highway cut between dense tree lines and wide drainage ditches, and where the exits came far apart like choices offered reluctantly. When the navigation suggested a rest area ahead, it felt less like a convenience and more like permission. They saw the roadside panel before they saw the turnout. The sign looked official, reflective, clean enough to read through drizzle. The exit ramp curved down into a flat lot bordered by firs and alder, and the first impression was that everything was laid out correctly. The lane markings were visible. The light poles stood at sensible intervals. Picnic tables sat in a row on compacted gravel. The restroom building was the expected shape and color, with the expected placement of doors. But the lot felt unused in a way that was difficult to name. There was no litter, not even the harmless kind that collected naturally in public places. No crushed cups near curbs. No old receipts trapped in corners. No wind-blown wrappers. The asphalt was wet with recent rain, yet the puddles held no floating debris. Even the weeds at the lot edges looked trimmed back, as if maintained on a schedule. The air smelled wrong, too. It carried the clean dampness of rain and pine, but none of the other smells that usually followed humans. No sour hint of garbage. No faint ammonia from bathrooms. No fried grease on clothes, no stale cigarette smoke in corners. It felt like a set designed to resemble a rest area, without the mess that proved people had actually used it. The first detail that made the driver slow his steps was the camera placement. There were cameras on poles near the entrance and more near the restrooms, and at least one mounted under the canopy of a light fixture. They were not positioned the way security cameras usually were. They did not watch the far corners of the lot. They did not focus on the dumpsters, the vandalism hotspots, or the building doors. They were angled toward driver-side windows. They were set at a height and distance that made sense only if the priority was faces at arrival, the moment a person parked and looked up instinctively, scanning for safety. Multiple cameras detected. No posted agency signage. From a driver report, the driver searched for the comfort of official markings, a state seal, a department name, a posted notice explaining surveillance. He found none. No agency logos on poles, no warning decals on doors, no phone number for maintenance, no posted hours, no emergency location identifier. They walked toward the restroom building and saw another detail that made the skin tighten. A yellow sticker had been applied to a pole near the entrance lane, placed at eye level as if meant to be noticed. It had no logo, no agency code. Only a barcode and a string of numbers printed with the clean precision of an inventory label. The edges were sharp and dust-free. The adhesive looked recent, as if it had been pressed on carefully within the last day. One of the family members took a close photo of the sticker, not because they knew why it mattered, but because their instincts had shifted into documentation. Inside the restroom building, everything was too complete. The lights came on instantly with no flicker. The stalls were dry. The sinks were clean. The soap dispensers were full. The paper towel units were loaded. It looked ready for use, but it looked like it had never been used before. The floor carried no footprints. The mirrors held no smears. Even the trash bins were lined with fresh bags that sat perfectly folded, empty and uncreased. When one of them tested a faucet, water ran immediately at a steady pressure, not sputtering the way neglected plumbing often did. The water was cold enough to feel real. The sound echoed in the tiled space, and under it there was another sound, faint and steady, like an electrical hum that did not belong to simple lighting. They stepped back outside and noticed that one of the cameras had moved. Not dramatically, not fast. Just a slow mechanical tilt that tracked the movement of their car, as if the system had been waiting for them to arrive and was now adjusting to keep them framed. The passenger, a technically inclined relative who carried small tools for work, pulled a compact scanner from a bag. It was the kind of device used to check for interference and locate active transmitters. He ran a simple sweep, expecting nothing more than distant highway signals or the occasional stray frequency. Instead, the readout showed a stable uplink signal pulsing from near the restroom block. It was not public Wi-Fi. It was not a cell booster. It behaved like a dedicated transmitter sending data outward, consistently, as if the rest area existed primarily to collect and export something. RF scan shows active transmitter near the restroom block. From a technical note, the family did what families did when fear arrived disguised as uncertainty. They tried to turn it into a practical decision. They told themselves they were tired. They told themselves they were reading too much into camera angles. They told themselves the rest area might have been renovated recently and the signage not updated. Then they got back in the car and watched the cameras through the windshield. As the driver shifted into gear, the cameras adjusted before the car moved. They rotated with a small anticipatory precision, framing the vehicle's departure as if the system had already predicted the path the car would take out of the lot. The movement was subtle enough that it could have been dismissed as coincidence if it had happened once. It happened again on the passenger's dash footage when the driver eased forward and the camera corrected its angle to keep the driver's face centered. Later, when the family reviewed the footage, they saw something else that felt impossible to unsee. The cameras appeared to be aligned to the exact point where a person's eyes would lift when they looked for a sign telling them where they were, but there was no sign. They left the rest area without using the picnic tables, without finishing the planned break, and without stepping back into the restroom building again. They did not stop until they reached another turnout farther down the highway. That second sight was normal in the most relieving way. There was trash. There were scuffed floors. There were old graffiti marks, half cleaned. There were posted notices about maintenance, human neglect, imperfect and comforting. A formal inquiry followed in the weeks afterward because the family needed an anchor that did not rely on memory. They submitted photos. They provided approximate coordinates. They described the cameras and the barcode sticker. They asked which agency was responsible. The county response came back dry and definitive. The The site on record was listed as decommissioned. It was not supposed to have power. It was not supposed to be maintained. It was not supposed to be open. County records list the site as decommissioned. From a department reply, that line should have ended the matter, but it created a new rung in the evidence ladder instead. A decommissioned site could be neglected. It could be vandalized. It could be illegally occupied. What it should not have been was clean, powered, and equipped with a functioning transmitter. A patrol unit was dispatched weeks later as a procedural follow-up, more to satisfy paperwork than to confirm a horror story. The officer found a turnout that matched the described ramp, but the scene did not match the family's experience. The restroom building was present but locked. The picnic tables were there but weathered and stained. The light poles did not appear powered. The lot looked like a place that had been left behind. The cameras, however, were still there, mounted high, pointed inward, quietly aligned toward the space where a driver's face would be framed at arrival. The barcode sticker was gone, scraped clean, leaving only a faint rectangular residue on the pole. Poles showed mounting hardware consistent with cameras. No agency identifiers located. From a patrol note, the family never returned. They did not want to be recorded again. They did not want to provide a second set of images for a system that seemed to gather proof of their presence more eagerly than it provided proof of its own legitimacy. The only close-up artifact that remained was the photo of that yellow sticker, crisp enough to show the barcode clearly. When they attempted to run the number through public databases and inventory registries, it returned nothing. Not unregistered, not invalid. Nothing, as if the code had been generated to look correct, rather than to exist inside any known system. In hindsight, the most unsettling part was how ordinary the rest area had appeared at first glance. The layout was perfect. The lighting was correct. The facilities were complete. It was only after they noticed what the cameras were truly watching that they understood. The place was not designed for rest. It was designed for capture, archival transition. Surveillance implied observation, but the next case suggested something stronger. In the next location, the road did not merely watch. It changed overnight, and the morning proof looked like the earth had been smoothed closed by careful hands. They were not looking for trouble. Drew Sato and Malia Keene were simply trying to outrun a weather system that had stretched across 3 counties like a wet lid. The main highway had slowed to a crawl behind a chain of accidents and stalled trucks, and their navigation app began offering alternatives with the calm confidence of a machine that did not have to drive them. The suggested shortcut appeared as a thin gray line branching off the route, a connector through timberland that promised to cut off nearly half an hour. The turnoff arrived without warning. No official sign, no mile marker, only a break in the guardrail and a narrow apron of gravel sloping into dark trees. At first glance, it looked like the kind of service road locals used without thinking. That familiarity was what made it easy to accept. The unfamiliar part was the silence. Even with rain ticking on the windshield, there was no distant traffic hiss, no engine noise from any other vehicle, no echo of a town behind them. The world felt folded inward around the headlight beams. Malia started filming almost immediately, not as entertainment, but as a reflex to hold on to reality. Night video shows roadbed and gravel clearly. From the phone file, the footage later showed what they remembered: a defined roadbed with pale, crushed stone that flashed bright under headlights, shallow ditches on both sides, a crown in the center where heavy trucks had packed the gravel into a hard ridge, puddles that reflected the beams in broken shapes. Fresh stone had a particular look and smell, a mineral sharpness that suggested it had been laid recently. Drew drove slow, hands steady, avoiding the soft shoulders that could hide a rut deep enough to swallow a tire. The road curved through dense fir, then dipped into a shallow basin where fog hung low and white as breath. Their navigation stayed on, but the map details seemed to thin. Labels disappeared. The little blue dot continued forward, but the surrounding terrain became bland and featureless, as if the app had decided this section did not need to be described. They reached a turnout that looked intentionally flattened, a wide patch of compacted gravel like a staging area for logging trucks. Drew pulled in to let a faster vehicle pass, only to realize there was no one behind them. The turnout held the first detail that made the shortcut stop feeling like a shortcut. There were tire tracks in the gravel that did not behave like ordinary tracks. They started strong, deep, and fresh, then faded abruptly in the middle of the lot, as if the vehicle had been lifted rather than turned. Rain had not softened them yet. The edges were still sharp. Malia kept filming. Drew set the hazard lights for a moment, then shut them off when the amber flashes seemed too bright against the trees, like a signal offered to something in the dark. They decided to mark the turnout, partly to reassure themselves they could find their way back if the road degraded. Drew carried a small wooden stake in his trunk from a previous trip, the kind people used for roadside markers. He hammered it into the wet ground near the edge of the turnout, just where gravel met soil, and Malia recorded the action with the phone held close enough to catch the sound of wood taking impact. They dropped a pin in the navigation app. They took a still photo of the stake. They noted the compass direction of the road and the angle of a distinctive leaning spruce at the turnout's far edge. They acted like careful people because careful people believed care could protect them. The road carried them through without a direct incident, which in hindsight became part of what unsettled them. It behaved like a normal road for just long enough to establish trust. Then, after a final curve, it rejoined pavement in a way that felt too neat, as if it had been placed there. They reached a motel in the nearest larger town, slept in fragments, and woke to daylight that made the night's choice feel irrational. Morning had that particular calm after a storm, the air rinsed clean and bright. A rational mind in daylight tried to classify the shortcut as simple risk-taking and move on. But the stake and the footage existed. That meant the road could be proven. They returned on foot because their minds needed to anchor what had happened. Driving back felt too easy to get wrong, too easy to miss a turn, so they parked at the highway shoulder where they remembered the break in the guardrail, and they walked, following the coordinates they had saved. The forest was different in daylight, less threatening, more ordinary. Birds moved in branches, the ground steamed faintly where sun warmed wet soil. For several minutes it felt like the night had been exaggerated by fatigue. Then they reached the coordinates. There was no road. There was not even the remnant of a road. Where the gravel apron should have been, there was grass. Not tall grass reclaiming a neglected track. Not weeds forcing themselves through stones. New grass flattened like fresh sod. The edges were smooth and deliberate, as if someone had cut the land into a clean rectangle and stitched it closed. Malia stepped forward and felt the ground give slightly under her shoe. The soil beneath was dark, damp, and recently turned. It had the smell of raw earth, like a garden bed after a shovel. It was not the smell of a shoulder that had been driven on. No stones rose through it. No gravel pressed into it, no ditch lines, no culvert mouth, no drainage cuts. Morning, same coordinates show no road, soil disturbed. From the protocol, the stake was still there, and it was the only reason their story did not collapse into a claim that could be brushed away as a wrong turn. The stake had been snapped in half. The lower portion remained embedded, but the top half was pressed down into soil at an angle, partially buried as if someone had broken it and then hidden it without taking it. Dirt clung to the split wood in a way that looked fresh, not dried. There were no footprints around the stake besides theirs, no boot tread approaching from the trees, no drag marks, no sign of someone kneeling, no cigarette butts, no tool impressions. It was as if the act of breaking and burying had been done without a body standing there. Malia filmed the stake close enough to show the grain of the wood and the dampness of the soil packed around it. Drew dug with a small multi-tool, trying to expose what remained of the lower stake, and found the ground compacted in layers like it had been pressed flat after being disturbed. His fingers came away black with wet soil that did not match the lighter, sandy loam around the road shoulder. They walked the area in widening circles looking for any sign of gravel. They found none. They found a faint seam in the grass where the sod changed direction, like a patchwork that had been rolled out quickly. They found a single pebble that could have been ordinary, except it was the same pale crushed stone as the roadbed in the night footage, sitting alone on top of new grass like a mistake left behind. They tried the simplest test they could think of. Drew followed the saved route line on his phone and watched the blue dot move across what the map still insisted was a road. The device behaved as if he were walking along a drivable track, but his eyes saw only grass. The mismatch between map and ground created a new kind of unease. It suggested the road was not merely hidden. It suggested the road still existed in some system, somewhere, even if the earth had been smoothed over. They reported it that afternoon. Not to a friend, not to social media, but through the channels that created paper trails. A non-emergency call, a short statement, a request for a patrol unit to confirm the location so the report could not be dismissed as confusion. The responding officer treated it like a routine complaint until he saw the stake and watched the night footage on Malia's phone. The video showed the roadbed clearly, the ditches, the turnout, the leaning spruce. It showed Drew planting the stake under headlight glare. The officer compared the tree line in the video to the tree line in daylight and noted the alignment matched. The location was correct. His written notes stayed cautious. They described disturbed soil and no visible roadway. They described the broken stake as partially buried. They described the absence of machinery tracks as unusual but not impossible, because reports preferred the language of plausible doubt. They asked a road department contact informally whether any work had been done overnight. No permit had been issued. No maintenance crew had been scheduled. No private contractor had filed notice. The area, on official layers, did not list a public road at that coordinate. The next rung in the evidence ladder arrived when Drew, stubborn and methodical, compared satellite imagery history through publicly available mapping tiles. He noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The most recent tile update showed a faint rectangular inconsistency where the road should have been, like a patch placed over a seam. It did not align with seasonal change. It looked like an edit. Satellite tile history shows mismatch in last update. From a technical note, a second inspection took place days later, prompted by the initial report and the existence of the stake. The soil had settled slightly, smoothing over Drew's shallow digging. Rain had fallen again, and the surface held no tracks beyond the two travelers' new footprints. The seam in the grass remained. The lone pale pebble was gone. The official conclusion leaned toward the convenient explanation. Misinterpretation of an older track at night. Incorrect coordinates in daylight. But the coordinates matched the saved pin. The night footage matched the trees. The stake matched the action they remembered. The ground looked made new. In the weeks that followed, Drew and Malia stopped trusting shortcuts that appeared too helpful. They stopped taking routes that their phones suggested when the surrounding map detail felt thin or blank. They kept their recordings. They kept the broken top half of the stake sealed in a plastic bag. Soil still stuck to the split wood because it was the closest thing they had to proof that the land itself could be altered. The most disturbing part was not the idea that a road could disappear. Roads washed out. Roads were gated. Roads were abandoned. Those were ordinary failures of infrastructure. What they saw felt like something else entirely. It felt like an act of concealment performed with care, archival transition. If a road could be erased without tracks or machines, then a crossing could be installed just as cleanly. The next case offered a bridge that did not exist in daylight and waited to appear only after the sun went down. The first report came from a person who had no reputation for exaggeration. Evelyn Hart worked as a volunteer trail steward for a small county partnership that maintained informal routes around public land. Her role was unglamorous and procedural. She walked sections after storms. She noted washouts. She photographed downed trees. She wrote short, practical journal entries because that was what her coordinator required. On an overcast afternoon in early autumn, Evelyn scouted a narrow creek crossing along an unmarked connector that hikers used to avoid a longer loop. The creek was shallow, running over stones and dark moss. The banks were slick but manageable. There was no sign of construction, no cut lumber, no rope, no posts, no broken branches that suggested recent dragging. She wrote it down the way she wrote down everything else. No bridge present during daylight scout. From the journal, if the story ended there, it would have been nothing. The kind of routine note buried among dozens of similar entries. But that same evening, a call came from a search and rescue coordinator asking for help locating a missing day hiker who had failed to return to the trailhead before dusk. The search map included the connector Evelyn had walked. The creek crossing was a pinch point. The coordinator wanted eyes on it before the night got too deep. Evelyn returned after sunset because she believed in procedures and because the phrase "missing day hiker" carried a gravity that made personal comfort feel irrelevant. She parked in the same pullout she had used earlier. She walked the same section with a headlamp, a spare flashlight, and a cheap handheld weather meter clipped to her pack strap. The forest at night shifted into a narrower world. The tree line swallowed distance. Sounds became selective. Her headlamp showed only what it touched, and everything beyond that circle became guesswork. She recognized the approach to the creek by a distinctive boulder shaped like a tilted jaw. She remembered stepping down from it in daylight, careful not to slip, and she expected the same wet stones and the same sound of shallow water. Instead, her headlamp caught straight lines. A wooden plank bridge spanned the creek from bank to bank, positioned neatly where she had crossed earlier. It sat low, only a few feet above the water. The planks ran perpendicular to the direction of travel, close enough together to look intentional, with no gaps large enough to suggest improvisation. The wood was not fresh-cut pale. It was darkened as if it had been exposed for a while. But the surface sheen was new. The planks were wet, not damp in the casual way a forest stayed damp at night. Wet like recent rain, like something had been washed, dragged, or carried across them with enough water to leave a uniform film. Evelyn paused long enough to listen for the one thing she expected if a bridge had been built nearby, the smell and sound of work. There was neither. No sawdust, no disturbed soil near the approaches, no nails or metal glint in her light. It looked assembled and finished, as if it had always been there, except she knew it had not been there hours earlier. She began filming on her phone because she understood that memory would not be considered evidence. Night footage shows plank bridge, humidity anomalously high. From video and weather data, her weather meter showed humidity higher than the forecast and higher than her daylight reading by a margin that made her frown. The air around the creek felt thicker than the air behind her on the trail, as if a pocket of moisture had been sealed in and held there. Her breath fogged in front of her face in a way that did not match the temperature. A rope hand line ran along one side of the bridge. It was tied to rough posts set into the banks, the knots clean and tight. The rope itself looked new, but not store-bought bright. It had the dull fiber texture of something practical, chosen to look normal. Near the center of the bridge, a strip of cloth was tied to the rope like a marker. The cloth moved slightly in the night breeze. It was frayed at the edges, but not dirty. Evelyn lifted the cloth with 2 fingers and immediately regretted it. It smelled like antiseptic. Not a vague chemical smell that could be mistaken for sap or damp plastic. Antiseptic in the way a clinic smelled when you walked in, and your brain registered clean as an alarm. Sharp, sterile, wrong for forest air. She lowered the cloth and felt her stomach tighten, because that smell suggested something beyond weather and wood. It suggested injury, procedure, or intent. Evelyn did not cross immediately. She scanned the banks and the water beneath the bridge, looking for an explanation that could be written down. She saw the second detail that made her hands begin to shake. Footprints. On the far side, where the bridge met soil, there were tracks leading into the timber. They were not deep, as if the person who made them had not put much weight into the ground, or as if the soil had been prepared to accept them. They were clear despite that, each outline crisp enough to measure. The spacing between steps varied oddly. One stride shorter than the next, then longer, then short again. It suggested limping, but it also suggested something with a gait that did not match the rhythm of a typical adult walking on level ground. Evelyn used her flashlight to illuminate the prints at an angle. The edges were too clean. The ground around them looked smoothed, almost combed. Her mind offered animal explanations and discarded them. Deer prints did not look like that. Raccoon prints did not look like that. Human prints did not move with that irregular cadence unless the person was injured. She reported the bridge and the footprints to the coordinator, focusing on what she could document. The coordinator instructed her to remain at the crossing until a deputy and a ranger arrived. It was the correct procedure, and Evelyn followed it despite every instinct pushing her to retreat. During the wait, she listened. The creek ran under the bridge with a soft sound that felt muted, like water moving through cloth. The forest beyond the far bank stayed quiet. No branches snapped, no animal movement. The absence of normal small sounds became its own presence. When the deputy arrived, his first reaction was irritation. He had the posture of someone expecting a false lead. The irritation changed when he saw the bridge under headlights and realized it was not a metaphor. He turned on his body camera and stepped closer, testing the planks with his boot. Water beaded on the wood and rolled off in slow drops. The planks did not creak. They did not shift. They felt solid and practiced, like they had been crossed many times. The ranger arrived minutes later and began documenting the footprint line, measuring stride length and noting the inconsistent spacing. His notes stayed professional, but his face tightened in the way people's faces tightened when their training offered no comfortable category. Footprints measured inconsistent gait pattern. From the protocol, they debated crossing in procedural terms, and the decision came down to risk. The far bank led into unmanaged timber, steep and dense. A missing hiker might be there, and that fact pushed against hesitation. The deputy crossed first. The bridge held his weight without complaint. The water beneath did not splash or react in any unusual way. But Evelyn noticed something small and impossible in the deputy's movement. His boot left no wet prints on the planks. The wood was wet enough that a sole should have marked it. There should have been darker impressions where rubber pressed water aside. There were none. The surface sheen remained uniform, as if the water sat on top of the wood without allowing contact like a coating. She did not mention it out loud. She only filmed. On the far side, the deputy followed the footprints for a short distance into the trees and then stopped abruptly. The ranger joined him. Their flashlights moved in tight circles as if searching for a specific object. Evelyn watched from the near bank and waited for a call to cross or retreat. Instead, The deputy returned quickly, moving with controlled speed. The footprints ended in a patch of ferns. There was no sign of a person, no dropped gear, no broken branches, no scuffed leaves. The prints did not fade naturally. They stopped clean, as if the last step had been taken and then nothing more had followed. The deputy suggested they continue the search along other routes. The ranger agreed. They returned to the bridge and started back. Halfway across, the ranger paused and leaned toward the rope line where the cloth strip was tied. He looked at it, then looked away as if he had seen something that did not translate into language. He did not touch it. Evelyn noticed a new detail in that moment. The cloth strip had not moved in the breeze for several minutes. It hung still, stiff, as if the fabric had been starched or dried by something other than air. When Evelyn directed her flashlight toward it, the antiseptic smell seemed stronger, and she fought the urge to step back. They finished the night search without finding the missing hiker. Evelyn returned home with her video, her journal entry, and the lingering feeling that she had stood at a doorway that only opened at certain hours. The next morning, external procedure escalated, as it often did when a report included evidence. A patrol unit and the ranger returned in daylight. Evelyn accompanied them because she wanted to anchor the sequence in her own mind, and because she believed daylight would force the bridge to remain. There was no bridge. Only the shallow creek running over stones. Only moss and slick banks. No posts, no rope, no cloth strip, no planks. The boulder shaped like a tilted jaw was still there. The approach trail was still there. The space where the bridge had sat felt too empty, like a missing tooth. The ranger searched for hardware scars, disturbed soil, anything that would prove posts had been installed. He found only faint scuffing on the far bank, a disturbed smear in the ferns that could not be explained by deer or wind. The deputy walked along the creek line looking for displaced boards or rope ends and found nothing. Evelyn stood at the exact spot where she had filmed the night before and watched her phone's map. The connector was still labeled as passable. The creek crossing was still marked. The system behaved as if a bridge existed. The land behaved as if it did not. The case was filed as an unconfirmed structure sighting with attached media and weather data, noted but not interpreted. The missing hiker was found later that week, miles away, alive but disoriented, unable to account for a full night. He had no memory of crossing a bridge. He had no memory of the creek at all. Evelyn kept the one detail that refused to leave her mind. The antiseptic smell had been too clean to belong to the woods. It implied that whatever wanted someone to cross that creek wanted the crossing to feel human-made, safe, responsible, as if the structure existed to help, not trap, and that was the part she could not write into any official report without sounding unstable. Archival transition. In several cases, the road did not simply change, it communicated. The next warning was blunt, handmade, and accurate, and the response from the dark came back in a pattern too precise to be accidental. The group had not been looking for trouble. They were four friends on a late-season drive toward a rented cabin, the kind of trip planned around cheap groceries, bad weather, and a promise to unplug for a weekend. Their route cut off the main highway and followed a two-lane road that narrowed into timberland, where the shoulders dropped away and the trees leaned in close enough to make the sky feel smaller. They noticed the sign because it looked wrong in a familiar way, like something meant to be seen and dismissed. A plywood board had been nailed to a post at the edge of a turnout. The paint was crude and thick, the letters uneven but legible. No signal. There was no agency stamp, no reflective coating, no warning icons. The nails were what caught one of them first. They were uniform, identical heads, evenly spaced like they came from the same box and were driven by someone who cared about symmetry more than speed. Warning sign photographed, no agency logo. From the photo record, they passed it anyway. The road did not look closed. The asphalt was intact. There were no barricades, no cones, no fresh gravel. It was easier to treat the sign as a joke than as information. The dead zone arrived gradually, then all at once. One phone lost a bar. Another dropped to emergency only. Their music stream buffered and stopped. The navigation map kept moving but stopped loading detail, the background turning into a simplified smear that made the road feel unacknowledged. Even the car radio, which usually found at least a faint weather band in the mountains, fell into a blank hiss. They drove a few more minutes expecting service to return on the next bend. It did not. The trees thickened. The road's painted centerline vanished. The sky lowered into a wet, dark ceiling. They pulled into a small gravel turnout because the feeling of being unreachable had started to feel physical, like pressure in the ears. Hazard lights clicked on and reflected off the damp trunks in slow pulses. The only other light was what their headlights could hold. They tried the obvious things. Airplane mode on and off. Phone restarts, different carriers, different devices, nothing changed. Their screens became bright rectangles with no connection to anything outside the car. One of them filmed the sign behind them through the rear window, not because they expected evidence to matter, but because a human brain wants to anchor fear to an object. The plywood board sat in the same place, still readable in the red glow of their taillights. No signal. Then they decided to try something else. They stepped out into the cold air and pointed a flashlight toward the tree line, as if the darkness could be treated like a person who might answer. The first signal was a simple distress pattern, improvised into the nearest thing they could remember. The beam cut across wet branches and disappeared. The response came back from deeper in the woods. A row of lights appeared between the trunks, not scattered, not wandering, not held at the uneven height of hikers. They were evenly spaced, aligned like markers along an invisible line. They blinked in a rhythm so stable it felt mechanical. On, off, repeating with no drift. The group froze in the turnout, caught between the relief of being noticed and the instinct that something had been waiting to notice them. One of them raised a phone and recorded with shaking hands, whispering into the microphone without meaning to create a record. We sent SOS. Something answered from the trees, from the phone video narration. Back in town later, someone ran the clip frame by frame and counted the interval between blinks using the embedded time code. The pattern repeated with the same spacing over and over, clean enough to feel rehearsed. Light pattern repeats every 8 seconds. From video analysis, they tried to interpret it as hikers, a hunting party, a parked vehicle reflecting beams, anything normal. But the lights did not move with the wind. Branches swayed, leaves fluttered, and the lights remained fixed, holding position as if attached to something heavier than a person. The group's hazard lights continued blinking behind them, and another detail slid into place with a slow, sick realization. The forest lights began to synchronize. Not perfectly at first, but close enough to feel intentional. A fraction of a beat behind the hazards, then closer, then matched, as if the darkness had taken a moment to learn the tempo. They did not speak much after that. Their bodies did what bodies did when the mind ran out of explanations. Their shoulders rose, their breathing shortened. Their eyes kept darting to the same line of blinking points. They attempted another signal with the flashlight, changing the pattern, trying to see whether the lights would remain steady or respond. The row answered by altering its rhythm with the same calm precision, shifting just enough to mirror the new cadence. It did not brighten like excitement. It did not scatter like confusion. It adjusted, the way a system adjusted when it recognized input. The sensation was not of being rescued. It was of being tested. They got back into the car and tried to leave. The road out should have been simple. Reverse, turn, follow the asphalt, back to the last marked intersection. But the moment the car rolled forward, The lights in the trees seemed to grow closer without actually moving, as if distance had been edited. The line remained between trunks, but the spaces between points looked tighter, the glow larger, the blink sharper. Another phone video captured the moment their navigation map rotated and recentered, then lost the ability to name anything around them. The road displayed as a thin line through blankness, the same kind of blank label effect that had appeared in earlier files, as if the system refused to commit to a place name. They kept driving. A mile later, the road curved, and the lights were visible again through a gap in the trees, still blinking, still evenly spaced, still maintaining that same measured interval. It felt like the line had not stayed behind. It felt like it had paced them. They reached for help the only way they could. They drove faster, eyes straining for any sign of another vehicle, any porch light, any mailbox, any human texture that meant a town was nearby. Later review of regional highway cameras produced an external check. During the window in which the group reported being stopped and then pursued by the repeating lights, nearby highway cameras logged no other vehicles entering that segment of road from either direction. No headlights, no taillights, no traffic that could explain a line of synchronized blinking points. No other vehicles logged on nearby highway cameras. From the report, when they finally regained service, it returned as abruptly as it had vanished. Bars appeared. Messages flooded in. The world came back loud and demanding, as if nothing had happened. They reported the incident, and a deputy met them the next day to drive the route. The turnout existed. The post existed. The plywood sign did not. The deputy noted the post holes on the wood post, where something had been mounted recently. The holes were too clean, edges sharp, as if drilled or nailed in within the last day. There was no discarded plywood in the brush, no paint flecks, no broken board. It was as if the warning had been removed after it had served its purpose. The close-up artifact became the photograph, taken before the dead zone fully tightened around them. It showed the sign clearly. It showed the uniform nails. It showed the crude paint. It did not show any agency logo because there had been none. The group agreed on one lasting change without ever naming it as trauma. They stopped trusting handmade warnings, and they stopped trusting the comfort of technology on roads that felt too empty. They began choosing routes with more traffic, more signage, more noise. They learned to interpret silence as a message. Archival transition. In earlier cases, signals appeared as lights and taps and repeating patterns. In the next file, the signal did not come from the trees at all. It came from the driver's own voice, returned after a delay, and then modified as if learning how to speak ahead of him. The driver's name was Grant Harlow, and he had built his nights around small routines that kept fatigue from turning into a mistake. He ran rural supply routes for a contracting outfit, the kind of work where you learned which stretches of highway had no shoulder, which valleys swallowed signal, and which back roads stayed empty enough to make your own headlights feel like company. Grant kept a dash-mounted recorder running on overnight drives. It was not paranoia, just habit. He had been sideswiped once on a dark merge and learned how quickly a story could be rewritten when there was no audio, no timestamp, no proof of what the cabin sounded like before the impact. His recorder captured cabin noise, engine hum, and whatever the radio happened to be doing. That mattered later because the first anomaly did not arrive with drama. It arrived with familiarity. He was alone on a long, unlit stretch where the trees pressed close and the road markings faded to intermittent reflectors. He spoke to himself the way tired people did, narrating small observations to stay awake. He made a short comment about the weather, then let it go, hands steady at the wheel. Exactly 1 minute later, the radio returned the same phrase in the same voice. It was not a similar voice. It was not a stranger with matching cadence. It was Grant, down to the way he clipped consonants when he was tired. I heard myself on the radio like a clean replay, and it landed exactly 1 minute after I spoke. From the dash recorder transcript at first, he treated it as interference. Rural channels bled into each other. Old repeaters sometimes threw reflections. He toggled between stations, adjusted the volume, tapped the faceplate like that could knock loose a bad connection. The radio did not change its behavior. It waited. Grant tested the idea because disbelief demanded a counterweight. He spoke another short line into the cabin, watching the road the whole time, keeping his tone casual as if casualness could keep the world normal. He waited, counting the seconds in his head. 1 minute later, the radio repeated him again, same pitch, same timing, as if the broadcast had been cued and delivered on schedule. Audio shows 1 minute delayed playback, same timbre. From a spectral analysis note, his body reacted before his logic did. His shoulders tightened. A thin sweat formed under his collar despite the cold. He felt the primitive discomfort of being copied, as if something had taken a mold of his voice without asking. Grant tried to break the pattern by going silent. He drove without speaking, letting the engine and tires fill the cabin. The radio filled the gap anyway, playing a soft hiss that sounded almost like an open mic. Then it played the sound of his breathing, 1 minute delayed, faint but unmistakable, as if the device had decided his voice was not required, his presence would do. He pulled off at a wide gravel apron near a locked gate, left the engine running, and checked his phone. He had no service. He checked his navigation and found it showing road lines without detail, the map reduced to a skeleton that refused to label the place. He checked the radio again and heard his own earlier cough return from the speaker with the same measured delay. Grant did what people did when they wanted a mechanical explanation. He tried to locate the cause. He kept a paper binder in the passenger seat with route notes, and inside it was a printed list of radio resources from a safety course, including references to registered repeaters and known dead zones. He could not access databases from the road, but he wrote down the frequency and the rough area so he could verify it later. He told himself this was a known phenomenon, a loop, a technical quirk that would become boring once it had a name. The next morning he did check. He filed a request through a contact who worked in communications and pulled a registry search for the area. No nearby repeaters registered for frequency. From the reference statement that should have ended it, if no repeater existed, then the echo should have been impossible. But the echo did not care what the system said was possible. The change began small enough to miss. Grant spoke a short sentence to himself again, testing the delay out of stubbornness and disbelief. 1 minute later, the radio returned his voice, but the replay carried one extra word that Grant had not spoken. The word fit the sentence naturally. It sounded like something he would have added if he had been thinking faster. He stared at the dashboard, then at the road ahead, then back at the radio, trying to decide whether he had misremembered his own speech. He played the recorder back in short segments at the next stop, using headphones because he did not want the car speakers participating. The original sentence was clean. The extra word was not there. He drove on with a tight jaw and a new rule in his head. Say as little as possible. The echo adapted. Grant wrote his observations in the route logbook he kept for fuel, mileage, and stops. His handwriting changed after that night. Letters tighter, notes shorter, as if reducing words could reduce risk. It started repeating me, then it added a word I had not said yet. From the driver's logbook, the close-up object that anchored the case was the audio file itself. Grant copied the dash recording to a laptop and isolated the relevant, minute-long segments. He marked the moment where the radio inserted the extra word and compared it against the later moment in the drive, when Grant, unaware he had been pre-broadcast, naturally used the same word in a different sentence. That was where the story stopped being a simple delay. The sequence suggested sampling, prediction, and rehearsal. A radio technician later reviewed the file for a formal opinion. He noted the consistent delay as a plausible artifact of rebroadcasting, but he could not account for the predictive insertion without invoking manipulation outside normal interference models. The technician asked for the original device and the raw recording rather than a compressed copy, because compression could introduce artifacts. Grant provided everything. The external review produced a cautious conclusion that sounded professional and empty at the same time. Interference could explain repetition, but it does not explain anticipatory word insertion in sequence. From the radio forensics summary after that, Grant stopped using the radio on night routes. He drove with it turned off, letting the cabin settle into engine noise and the low rush of tires. He thought silence would feel safer. Silence felt worse. Without the radio, he could hear the smaller sounds, the minute clicks of cooling plastic, the subtle buzz of the dash electronics, the way the cabin air shifted when he breathed. Those noises became their own countdown. He found himself listening for an echo that might not need a speaker anymore. He began leaving his dash recorder on anyway, not because he wanted proof, but because he was no longer confident his memories belonged entirely to him. He wanted something external to verify what the night sounded like. Weeks later, he noticed a final detail while reviewing a different drive for unrelated reasons. In the background hiss between stations, there was a faint, almost playful cadence that matched his own speech rhythm, as if the system had learned the shape of his voice and could hum it without words. Grant stopped narrating his nights. He stopped making jokes to himself. He stopped filling silence with human sound. He had learned something he could not prove in court but could not unlearn in his body. Once a system captured your voice, it did not simply repeat it, it practiced. Archival transition. When the system learned a voice, it gained leverage. The final case showed what that leverage looked like when the caller asked for help and the system refused to admit the road existed. The caller's name was Jonah Mercer, and he was not the type of person who called emergency services unless he had exhausted every other option. He had been driving alone after a late shift, taking a state route that cut through timberland to avoid construction on the main highway. The weather had been clear, the road mostly empty, and the kind of quiet that made a person's thoughts feel louder than the engine. Jonah missed his intended turn because the detour signage was inconsistent. One arrow pointed one way, the next one was missing entirely. He followed what he believed was the correct county connector and found himself on a narrower road with a lower speed limit and no reflectors along the shoulder. The pavement changed texture, then changed again, the surface turning from maintained blacktop to older asphalt with patched seams. His phone lost service without warning. His navigation froze, then refreshed into a simplified display that showed his vehicle moving through a gray field with no labels. He kept going because turning around felt riskier than continuing. The road dipped between tall trees and climbed into a corridor of dark timber where even the moonlight seemed filtered and weak. Then his car gave a soft, mechanical chime, and a dashboard warning lit up. Not catastrophic, but enough to force a decision. He pulled onto the shoulder where the ground was firm and flat, as if designed to hold a stopped vehicle. In his headlights, he saw the road marker. It stood on a standard post, clean and reflective. The font looked official. The marker displayed a road name and a mile number in the format used by the county. The strange part was one letter in the road name, where a neat patch had been applied over the original, changing the word by a single character. It was the kind of small alteration that could turn a real road into something that no database could match, while the sign still read as legitimate to the human eye. Jonah took a photo because the sign felt like the one thing that could anchor him to a system. He then did what stranded drivers did when they wanted to stay rational. He documented the mile number, the nearest visible landmark, and the direction he had been traveling. His first few call attempts failed. Then a weak connection formed, and he reached dispatch with audio thin enough to crackle, but clear enough to transmit his urgency. He reported the road name exactly as he saw it, including the mile number and the patched letter detail, because he could sense he was already sliding toward disbelief. Dispatcher said there was no such road in the system. From the 911 transcript, the dispatcher followed protocol anyway. Jonah gave the information again, slower. He stated the mile number and described the sign's patched letter as precisely as he could, because the patch felt like the point of the problem, the place where the world had been edited. At the dispatcher's request, Jonah attempted to send the photograph. The message did not go through, but the photo remained in his gallery and would later be recovered through device access connected to the case file. The image showed the sign clearly in the beam of headlights, readable, official-looking, and unmistakably real in frame. The photo showed a road marker with a name and a mile number. From the phone gallery recovery note, the dispatcher asked Jonah to remain where he was. That was standard. It was also the moment the call ended. The carrier log later recorded the disconnection with a precision that made it feel deliberate. The drop occurred at an exact timestamp, not a range, not a rough approximation. The disconnect hit like a switch being flipped, as if someone had cut the line rather than signal fading naturally. The call dropped at exactly 2, 14, and 17 seconds after the hour. From the carrier log, what followed was the external procedure that should have resolved everything. A patrol unit was dispatched to locate Jonah using the provided road name, mile number, and landmark description. The deputy first attempted the administrative route, checking the county road database and the mapping system used by dispatch. The road name did not exist, not under the spelling Jonah reported, not under close variants, not under older naming conventions. The system returned nothing, as if the road had never been recorded. The deputy then attempted the practical route, driving the larger area Jonah described and searching for any marker that matched the photo's format. The unit located a service track in the general region, but it dead-ended at a locked gate with posted warnings for authorized vehicles only. There was no mile marker, there was no shoulder pullout, there was no reflective sign with a patched letter. The pavement did not match what Jonah described. The terrain did not match what his photo suggested. The patrol report described the search with careful language that avoided conclusions it could not prove. It stated that the named road could not be located. It stated that the database did not recognize the name. It stated that no stopped vehicle was found on accessible routes in the vicinity during the response window. A second check was initiated through county records, the same kind of bureaucratic verification used in the earlier cases. The result was similarly blank. No listing, no municipality boundary, no maintenance designation, nothing to indicate the road existed as a named address. The only undeniable trace remained Jonah's artifact. The photograph showed the sign plainly, readable, centered, and lit. The patched letter was visible as a clean overlay, the edges straight and careful, as if someone had modified the sign without replacing it. The mile number was visible. The background was dark timber, consistent with the corridor of trees described by Jonah. The marker looked official enough that it should have been in a system somewhere. A review of the photo's metadata produced the familiar fracture seen across the other cases. The timestamp did not align neatly with the dispatcher's system time. It was off by a span that fit the earlier pattern of drifting minutes. The offset was not extreme, but it was enough to suggest Jonah's device and the county's devices were no longer sharing a single definition of time. Jonah was never found. No abandoned vehicle was recovered on mapped roads. No later pings were recorded from his phone after the disconnection. No emergency beacon activated. There was no follow-up call, no voicemail, no partial reconnect. It was as if the moment the system refused to recognize his address, Jonah had ceased to exist in the channels designed to locate him. Months later, when the file was reviewed alongside the earlier cases, the patched letter on Jonah's sign gained new weight. It resembled the other edits scattered through the archive. Receipts that carried impossible dates, logs that showed repeating minutes, labels that went blank where a name should have been. The pattern did not simply erase people, it altered the inputs people used to be found. Jonah had been standing under a sign that looked official in every way that mattered to a person. He had provided an address. He had provided a mile number. He had provided proof. The system answered with absence, and then it closed the line at the exact moment procedure demanded he stay put. Final note from the archive: across these 9 cases, the same mechanics returned in different forms. Names erased or altered, time split across devices, and procedures that ended in records of absence rather than rescue. Each case rose on the same ladder of evidence, moving from witness report to physical or digital artifact, then to independent verification failures, and finally to an external response that confirmed only what could not be found.